Irish Icons, International Interests. Exploring famous figures from Irish history through their attitudes to global events. This week, Daniel O'Connell and American slavery.
We went out around Dublin to find out what people knew about Daniel O'Connell.
I know he had something to do with workers' rights and unions, founding of unions, and that's about it. Oh, doesn't he have a statue as well on O'Connell Street?
He was heavily involved in Irish politics in the 19th century, known as the Liberator, and fought for emancipation for Ireland.
And did you know he was involved in fighting for American slavery or against it?
I did, although not very detailed. He's also involved in the Catholic Church. He was in Parliament for Dublin City till 1841, and then he went for Cork County from 41 on, I think, for 4 years.
Daniel O'Connell, I know he was the head of the Catholic Emancipation, in which he secured equal rights for Catholics as well as Protestants in Ireland anyway, but I'm not sure about the UK. Maybe the UK, but I'm not sure about that part of it. And then the only other thing I really know about Daniel O'Connell is that he's buried in Glasnevin under the big round tower there.
And would you know, or did it surprise you, the fact he was involved in fighting American slavery?
Was he really? I didn't know that now. No, I didn't know that.
The year is 1843. It is the year of Daniel O'Connell's monster meeting in Clifton, County Galway, building momentum for the repeal movement, calling for an Irish Parliament. For decades, O'Connell has agitated for the equality of Catholics and the self-rule of Ireland. Now he is 68 and 4 years from death, but crowds testify that the power of his voice has not wavered. The year is 1843. Across America, the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions Project tours the meeting halls of the eastern and midwestern states, with former slave Frederick Douglass as their star speaker. Tensions boiled. Wherever the abolitionists spoke, they were in danger. In Pendleton, Indiana, Douglas's hand was broken by a gang of thugs. Now it is October, the leaves turning and the nights lengthening. The year is 1843. 2 years from now, Douglas will come to Ireland, fleeing slave catchers, and meet with Daniel O'Connell. Douglas is young, but his mesmerising speaking style already earns him the nickname the Black O'Connell. In later years, Douglas will claim that this Irish welcome has inspired his vision of racial harmony. Yet all of this lies in the future. On this night, the 11th of October, by flickering candlelight in the Corn Exchange rooms in Dublin, O'Connell will sign the letter that puts him down in history as one of the greatest abolitionists of his age. The letter is his reply to Irish Americans. The committee of the Irish Repeal Association of Cincinnati has written to implore that O'Connell cease his agitations against American slavery, since it makes him unpopular with Americans and hurts their efforts to raise American support for the Irish Home Rule movement. The year is 1843. The people of the world are rising against oppression, and Daniel O'Connell faces a choice: to unite their struggles or to choose which cause is dearest to his heart. His letter begins.
Gentlemen, we have read, with the deepest affliction, not unmixed with some surprise and much indignation, your detailed and anxious vindication of the most hideous crime that has ever stained humanity, the slavery of men of colour in the United States of America. we are lost in utter amazement at the perversion of mind and depravity of heart which your address evinces. How can the generous, the charitable, the humane, the noble emotions of the Irish heart have become extinct amongst you?
It was easy enough for the Catholic Irish of Ireland, resenting the tyranny of English colonisers, to identify themselves with the slaves in America and feel sympathy for them. It was harder for the Irish immigrants to America, competing with black Americans to get ahead, to feel the same sympathy. For many, their whiteness was the only advantage they had, and they used it to the full. The sad history of Irish slave owners is today immortalised by the fictional O'Haras of Hollywood's Gone with the Wind, who would name their plantation Tara after the sacred mound of Irish sovereignty, as though resurrecting Irish independence in the New World on the backs of slaves. Coming from an Ireland where the Catholic majority had been denied the right to own land by the penal laws, and most remained dependent on landlords, O'Hara famously teaches his daughter Scarlett that land's the only thing that matters, it's the only thing that lasts. The fictional O'Hara had real-life models. In his letter, O'Connell reports the cruelty of a slave owner named Scanlon, with outrage at his obviously Irish ancestry. The liberator himself would not live to see the worst atrocities. The New York draft riots, in which a mob of Irish immigrants protested the draft to fight slavery in the Civil War by lynching 119 black Americans. This is a side to Irish history and the Irish experience that we are still uncomfortable with, and it shook O'Connell's image of his people's generosity and love of liberty to the core. Were the Irish at home natural enemies of tyranny, as O'Connell wanted to believe? Or were they enemies of tyranny only because they had no opportunity to profit from it? In his letter, O'Connell writes,
There has been a testimony borne against the Irish, by birth or descent, in America, by a person fully informed as to the facts and incapable of the slightest misrepresentation, a noble of nature more than of titled birth, a man gifted with the highest order of talent and the most generous emotions of the heart, the great, the good Lord Morpeth. He who, in the House of Commons, boldly asserted the superior social morality of the poorer classes of the Irish over any other people. He, the best friend of any of the Saxon race that Ireland or the Irish ever knew. He, amidst congregated thousands at Exeter Hall in London, mournfully but firmly denounced the Irish in America as being amongst the worst enemies of the Negro slaves and other men of colour.
To find out more, we spoke to Professor Patrick Geoghegan, author of King Dan, The Rise of Daniel O'Connell, 1775 to 1829. Professor Geoghegan, did O'Connell's agitation against slavery lose him significant support in his campaign for an Irish Parliament?
There were certainly some elements in the United States who were very unhappy with O'Connell taking such a strong stand on the slavery question. And you see that with groups in the south of the United States, but you also see it even in northern states which didn't have slavery, because some people were offended with the idea of O'Connell, an Irishman, lecturing the Americans on what they should do in their own country. But O'Connell was uncompromising. He said that the soil of the United States was contaminated by the sin of slavery. He wouldn't set foot in the country until slavery was removed. He denounced George Washington as a hypocrite because he owned slaves and only freed them on his deathbed. He attacked the Declaration of Independence because all men were not equal. The American ambassador to Britain challenged him to a duel in the 1830s because he was so vehement in his denunciations. And yet, even though this cut off huge amounts of money for O'Connell's repeal movement, he would not compromise. And in the same way, there were some in Ireland who were hostile to O'Connell because of this. They thought it was insulting the Americans, they thought it was undignified, and you see it as one of the issues between the Young Ireland movement and O'Connell in the 1840s. You see Queen Victoria writing in private about how she she thought O'Connell was disgraceful because of the way he treated Americans. But for O'Connell, you had to put principle first, and his principle was that all people were equal. He understood what it was like to grow up in a state of humiliation, a state of inferiority. He had this incredible emotional empathy with the plight of the enslaved men and women in the United States, and he was determined to speak up for them and to fight for them.
The idea that Irish Americans would seek to discredit abolitionists, would become enemies of liberty, was more than the liberator could stand. In his mind, men who took such a position were no longer to be considered Irish, but pseudo-Irish, excluded from the qualities that defined Irishness itself when they were not, in O'Connell's words, influencing as Irishmen ought to do, the public mind in favour of the oppressed. Unlike the Irish of Ireland, who welcomed Frederick Douglass as a peer and a comrade in the fight for freedom, O'Connell found the Irish of America unwilling even to imagine themselves in the place of the Negro.
If you yourselves, all of you, or if any one of you, were, without crime or offence committed by you, handed over into perpetual slavery, if you were compelled to work from sunrise to sunset without wages, supplied only with such coarse food and raiment as would keep you in working order, if, when your owner fell into debt, you were sold to pay his debts, not your own, if it were made a crime to teach you to read and to write, if you were liable to be separated in the distribution of assets from your wives and your children, if you, above all, were to fall into the hands of a brutal master, and you condescend to admit that there are some brutal masters in America, if among all those circumstances some friendly spirits of a more generous order were desirous to give liberty to you and your families, with what ineffable disgust would not you laugh to scorn those who should traduce the generous spirits who would relieve you, as you now, pseudo-Irishmen, shame upon you, have traduced and vilified the abolitionists of North America.
In response to claims that slavery was enshrined in the United States Constitution, O'Connell swept aside the claims of man-made law.
We repeat that we do not deign to argue this point with you, as we proclaim to the world our conviction that no constitutional law can create or sanction slavery. Slavery is repugnant to the first principles of society, but it is enough for us to say, as regards Americans, that it is utterly repugnant to that declaration of the equality of all men and to the inalienable right of all men to life and liberty. To this declaration the free citizens of the United States have, in the persons of their ancestors, solemnly pledged their sacred honour.
There were many abolitionists in America who felt that black men and women had to have liberty, as was pledged in the Declaration of Independence, but who did not believe they were equal. Abraham Lincoln famously believed black Americans were inferior, even while opposing slavery. And leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison would try to make Frederick Douglass focus only on the injustice he experienced as a slave, and not on the prejudice and discrimination he experienced as a free man in the North. Yet, after the abolition of slavery, the tyranny of lynching would prove that freedom and equality could not be achieved without confronting the roots of prejudice itself. Unusually, even among abolitionists, Daniel O'Connell had no patience with arguments that the black man was inferior. He was eager to remind his readers of the uncomfortable reality that white people too could be slaves, and that the psychology of dependency that slave owners described as childishness in their black slaves was also equally observed in white slaves.
Slavery actually brutalizes human beings. It is about 60 years ago when one of the sheikhs, not far south of Fez in Morocco, who was in the habit of accumulating white slaves, upon being strongly remonstrated with by a European power, gave for his reply that, by his own experience, he found it quite manifest that white men were of an inferior race, intended by nature for slaves, and he produced his own brutalized white slaves to illustrate the truth of his assertion.
Professor Geoghegan, how rare was O'Connell's belief in racial equality in the 1840s?
I think O'Connell's position was different to what we see in other parts of the world. There were some people certainly who were abolitionist in this period, but very often the abolitionism was of a kind where white people were against slavery because they thought it was a sin for the white man. They thought it was leading to a corruption of the white person, but they didn't necessarily believe in the inherent equality of the races. And so you have some white abolitionists who themselves were actually, by some standards, could be considered racist. O'Connell was very different. I think what you see with his position is that it was approaching it from a point of absolute empathy. And that's why the great black abolitionists of the 19th century revered O'Connell. Charles Lennox Reman said that all my life I thought I was an abolitionist, but I was wrong. Listening to O'Connell and his scorching denunciations made me realise what true abolitionism was. You see the same with Frederick Douglass when he visited Ireland in 1845, that O'Connell was someone who was able to capture their plight because it seemed as if O'Connell had lived that plight because of that incredible act of emotional awareness. Douglass had a very warm reaction in Ireland, and certainly a very warm reaction in Dublin, because he was there on the platform with O'Connell, the great liberator, the great emancipator. And when O'Connell introduced Douglass as the black O'Connell of the United States, there was a couple of things that worked there. First, it was O'Connell's legendary vanity. I mean, O'Connell considered himself the greatest person in Irish history, but there was more to it than just O'Connell's vanity. It was also O'Connell anointing Douglass as the person who would lead this fight in the United States. It was O'Connell recognizing that there would need to be someone like himself leading this campaign for emancipation and for freedom. And it was his way of saying that there needed to be a great orator, someone to represent the people. So I think that was why Douglass said afterwards that he felt at home in Ireland for the first time. Douglass, growing up, had learned the name of O'Connell because his master used to spit out the name at the curse. And O'Connell was someone whose name was known because here was this European figure, this Irishman, who was speaking out on their behalf and who was speaking for the cause of freedom.
It would be another 5 years before the Punch cartoonist John Leach would begin to draw the Irish as monkeys. But the idea that the Irish were racially inferior had been around for as long as English colonisation, despite their white skin. Wherever oppressors exploit the oppressed, they fear their revenge, and become eager to comfort themselves with the idea that their degraded state is a natural condition. For this reason, the same stereotypes would be used for colonised and enslaved peoples around the world, whatever their race. Swamped by a flood of anti-Irish propaganda in the British press, it was perhaps easier for Daniel O'Connell than for the American abolitionists to insist that a people could not be judged without taking account of their circumstances. O'Connell's letter continues.
We repeat, therefore, that to judge properly of the Negro, you should see him educated and treated with the respect due to a fellow creature, uninsulted by the filthy aristocracy of the skin, and untarnished to the eye of the white by any associations connected with his state of slavery.
At the heart of O'Connell's letter is a manifesto for Irish Americans and for all Irishmen that lays out the global struggle for equality that O'Connell saw as the particular calling of the Irish. The belief in global equality by which the Irish would justify their own equality. The hatred of global oppression by which the Irish would learn to reject their own oppression. To the general approval of his colleagues in the Corn Exchange, on that night of 1843, he read the lines that spelled out, in the mind of one of the greatest architects of the Irish nation, exactly what the values were that separate the pseudo-Irishman from the genuine Irishman, and for which the Irish nation stands. This is O'Connell's call.
have you enough of the genuine Irishman left amongst you to ask what it is that we require you to do? It is this. First, we call upon you, in the sacred name of humanity, never again to volunteer on behalf of the oppressor, nor even for any self-interest to vindicate the hideous crime of personal slavery. Secondly, we ask you to assist in every way you can in promoting the education of the free men of colour, and in discountenancing the foolish feeling of selfishness, of that criminal selfishness, which makes the white man treat the man of colour as a degraded or inferior being. Thirdly, we ask you to assist in obtaining for the free men of colour the full benefit of all the rights and franchises of a free man in whatever state he may inhabit. Fourthly, we ask you to exert yourselves in endeavouring to procure for the man of colour, in every case, the benefit of a trial by jury, and especially where a man insisting that he is a free man is claimed to be a slave. Fifthly, we ask you to exert yourselves in every possible way to induce slave owners to emancipate as many slaves as possible. The Quakers in America have several societies for this purpose. Why should not the Irish imitate them in that virtue? Sixthly, we ask you to exert yourselves in all ways you possibly can to put an end to the internal slave trade of the states. The breeding of slaves for sale is probably the most immoral and debasing practice ever known in the world. It is a crime of the most hideous kind, and if there were no other crime committed by the Americans, this alone would place the advocates, supporters, and practicers of American slavery in the lowest grade of criminals. Seventhly, we ask you to use every exertion in your power to procure the abolition of slavery by the Congress in the District of Columbia. Eighthly, we ask you to use your best exertions to compel the Congress to receive and read the petitions of the wretched Negroes, and above all the petitions of their white advocates. Ninthly, we ask you never to cease your efforts until the crime of which Lord Morpeth has accused the Irish in America, of being the worst enemies of the men of colour, shall be atoned for and blotted out and effaced forever. You will ask how you can do all these things. You have already answered that question yourselves, for you have said that public opinion is the law of America. Contribute, then, each of you in his sphere, to make up that public opinion.
Ireland has changed since the days of O'Connell, where once even the poorest peasant reportedly welcomed Frederick Douglass as an equal. We are now a multiracial society, with many immigrants from every nation. It is now possible for an Irishman to try to justify their own advantages by discrimination against a neighbour's race. According to the European Network Against Racism's November 2015 report, Afrophobia in Ireland, Irish people of African descent reported suffering frequent racial abuse, even by public institutions. Ireland is also now in a position to benefit from unequal trading relationships internationally, as our European Union membership places us in one of the most powerful trading groups on the planet. Who, then, are we? Are we the genuine Irishmen that Daniel O'Connell believed in, who would not allow any self-interest to lead them to defend oppression? Or are we the pseudo-Irishmen he attacked, who change their convictions with their circumstances and defend any discrimination that benefits them personally? A statue stands to Daniel O'Connell in the centre of Dublin City. Dressed in a cloak, with a hand laid across his heart, he stands high on a pedestal and watches over the pedestrians who hurry past below. Beneath his feet, the Maid of Erin points up at him as liberator, and figures from Irish society crowd around. Frederick Douglass does not appear. No black men or women are commemorated among the liberator's followers. Below the Irish stand 4 winged victories, representing patriotism, courage, eloquence, and fidelity. But can we speak of O'Connell's patriotism without mentioning that he defined the genuine Irishmen by their struggle against global oppression? Can we speak of O'Connell's courage without honouring his willingness to sacrifice the political advantage of Ireland in the cause of the American slave? Can we speak of O'Connell's eloquence without celebrating the eloquence of his letter to the Cincinnati Repeal Association, in which he lays these values out? Can we speak of his fidelity without recalling that he was faithful to the vision of racial equality until the end of his life? If we do not record these things, then who is it and what is it that we are commemorating? Who is O'Connell to Ireland today? Professor Geoghegan, what is the legacy of O'Connell's abolitionism today?
I think sadly for many years O'Connell was not remembered in Ireland for his campaign against slavery. Very often it was overlooked in favour of his campaign for Catholic civil rights, for the rights of other minorities, for his campaign to repeal the Act of Union and restore the Irish Parliament. It's only in recent years that we've come to appreciate that O'Connell was this great international statesman who wasn't just concerned with Irish affairs, but who was influencing movements all around the world with his campaigns for civil rights, with his demands for freedom, with his belief that these movements should be led through peaceful means, and that great change could be brought about through the use of moral force. And I think in this country there's now a great appreciation of O'Connell for having done all of that, and I think there's a re-evaluation of his legacy. I think in the United States O'Connell was remembered. His books, his speeches on slavery were republished in the years after his death. They were republished on the eve of the American Civil War. Frederick Douglass remembered him in his autobiography and spoke of how great O'Connell had been as a champion for freedom. So I think in other parts of the world, O'Connell's position as the great defender of freedom was acknowledged more, and it's only in recent years that we've come to recognise it in Ireland. I think President Barack Obama contributed to that because he visited Ireland in 2011 in May, and he gave a speech that was televised on national TV in front of the old Parliament building, the Parliament that O'Connell had worked so hard all his life to restore. And in that speech, Barack Obama only referenced two Irish figures. One was Garret Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, who had just died that weekend, and the other person was Daniel O'Connell. And the fact that of all of the great figures in Irish history, that President Obama chose to emphasise the legacy of O'Connell, well, that made people think and reevaluate, because President Obama could have chosen so many other figures, but he chose someone who had been a great icon to his own personal hero growing up. His own hero had been Frederick Douglass, and it showed how the legacy of O'Connell extended far beyond these shores.
Almost 2 centuries ago, in the Corn Exchange in Dublin, O'Connell put the finishing touches on his pages of political rant, outrage, patriotism, courage, eloquence, and fidelity, with one final message for his readers.
Irishmen, I call on you to join in crushing slavery and in giving liberty to every man of every caste, creed, and colour. Signed by order, Daniel O'Connell, Chairman of the Committee.
We are the builders of Daniel O'Connell's memorial. You've been listening to Irish Icons International Interests. Written, directed and narrated by Brigit McCone. Produced by Heather MacLeod. Performed by Steve Kenneally. With an exclusive interview with Professor Patrick Geoghegan.
This series is funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with a television licence fee.